The IFA due diligence process for the selection of funds within their investment solution comprises two elements. First of all, there is what we call the hard analysis, looking at the hard figures, called the quantitative screening process. And then we have what's called the soft analysis, i.e. meeting the fund manager face-to-face, which is qualitative. And I must stress that we always do the hard analysis, i.e. looking at the hard figures first, before we go and even meet the fund manager face-to-face. And what we're basically after when we select funds for inclusion in the IFA Limited investment solutions is favourable risk-adjusted returns, and I'll explain how we managed to achieve that. So first of all, looking at the hard analysis, looking at the hard facts and figures, we want a quantitative screen each month across the whole fund universe. That includes every IMA sector. And first of all, let's take, for example, the IMA equity income sector, which has about 100 funds. For each of those 100 funds, we will look at a 3-year return, annualised return, and a 3-year volatility for each of those 100 funds. So once we get those figures together, we can then divide up that universe of 100 funds and place them into one of 4 quadrants. And what we're particularly interested in is what we call funds in the northwest quadrant. Those are funds that have produced above peer group return with lower than peer group volatility, i.e. favourable risk-adjusted returns. In the northeast quadrant, you've got those funds that have produced above peer group return with above peer group volatility. And I have no problem with that, but we rather have below peer group volatility. In the southeast quadrant, you have those funds that have produced lower than peer group return with higher than peer group volatility, which for obvious reasons we're not interested in. And finally, in the southwest quadrant, you have those funds that have produced below peer group return with below peer group volatility. And what we've found with this process, which we've been running a number of years, those funds that are in the northwest quadrant, above peer group return with below peer group volatility, is only about 15 to 20% of the funds within that universe. So going back to the IMA equity income sector, out of 100 funds, we're now looking at between 50 and 20 funds. So what we do then is take that 15 funds, for example, and see on how many occasions over the past 3 years on a monthly basis they've actually produced better returns than their peer group with lower volatility, and that gives us what we call a persistency score. And we've found again with experience a persistency score of over 50% is good. So again we can begin to cut down the universe and only look at those funds with over 50% persistency. That probably gives us a universe of about 8 funds once we cut out those but with below 50%. The next stage, part of the QSP, is to look at 2 other factors. That's downside risk control and fund manager skill. And for each of those 2 characteristics, we use 2 ratios each. So let's look at the downside risk control. We use 2 ratios called the Sortino ratio and the Karma ratio. Looking at each in turn, the Sortino ratio is a cousin of the Sharpe ratio, and that has the same numerator, which is the return of the fund less the risk-free rate of interest divided by the downside volatility. So obviously those funds that have got a low downside volatility score a higher Sortino ratio. The Karma ratio is actually much easier to calculate and I think more effective. Let's take 2 funds, Fund A and Fund B. Fund A returns 10% over the 3 years and Fund B 12%. But let's say during that same 3-year period, Fund A dropped by 20%. Its Karma ratio is simply 10 divided by 20.5. Looking at Fund B, it returned 12%. But let's say during that same period, it dropped by 36%. Its Karma ratio is 0.3, 12 divided by 36. So we would choose Fund A because it's got a higher ratio, even though in absolute return terms, it was 10% versus 12%. But for each percent of return, it achieved it with less downside risk. And that's why we go for a higher Karma ratio. So we take those 2 funds ratios together, Sortino and the Karma, and usually A good Sortino ratio also means a good Karma ratio. And we want those two ratios to confirm each other. Let's go on to fund manager skill. Again, we use two ratios, the information ratio and the omega ratio. Now, the information ratio just measures the volatility of outperformance of a fund over time. So let's say the FTSE 100 index goes up 10% and the fund returns 12%. It's outperformed by 2%. We're looking at those 2% outperformances, whether it be 3% outperformance or 5% over time, and we're looking for low volatility of those outperformances. A fund manager can sometimes get lucky and still outperform an index, but it may be concentrated in 1 or 2 months. We're looking for funds that have consistent outperformance over time. And so the information ratio is the outperformance of the fund over a benchmark divided by the volatility of that outperformance. And obviously, if you've got low volatility, you'll have a higher information ratio, and that's what we're after. The second fund manager skill ratio is the omega ratio, which is purely a probability score of outperforming an index or underperforming an index based upon the results of the past 3 years. And obviously, we want funds with a higher probability of outperforming. Although the ratios themselves are quite interesting, where they really come into their own is comparing the funds with each other and ranking them across those 4 ratios. So let's assume you have a table at the top. At the top of the table, you'll have the headings information ratio, omega ratio, Karma or Sortino. And down the left-hand side, you'll have all the funds. And simply we rank them, say 1 to 15, where they appear on each of those ratios. And we simply add across and look at those funds with the lowest score, because obviously they'll produce the best downside risk control and also the fund manager skill. That gives us a short list. You can already see how we've cut down, say, a list of 100 funds to possibly 3 or 5 funds, where we want to go and see the fund manager face to face. And we always go and see the fund manager face to face before we invest in a fund. And when we go and see the fund manager face to face, we cover a wide range of discussion, and we're not looking for right or wrong answers. We're looking for him to tell us in a logical, rational way, can they explain how they've achieved that performance? What is their investment process? So in our discussion, we cover 5 broad areas. First of all, the philosophy of the fund, and the philosophy, his philosophy of the markets. Do they believe the markets are efficient? Do they believe the markets are efficient in certain areas, e.g. smaller companies? And why does he do the job? We then look at the team and the fund manager, their qualifications, how long have they been doing the job, where have they worked before, how long have they been with this company, and most importantly, do they invest in their own fund? Are they backed up by analysts? Is it a big team? We look at their investment style. How would they describe their investment style? Is it growth, value, momentum? Again, we're not looking for right or wrong answers. We're looking for a description of how they would describe it. The buy-sell criteria, what makes them buy companies. More interestingly, what makes them sell a company? Do they get it wrong? And finally, the economic cycle. Do they take the economic cycle into account when they're investing in companies? For example, in this type of economic climate, which is difficult at the moment, are they weighted towards defensive companies, or do they completely disregard the economic cycle and just look for good companies that can ride it out over time? This lasts from about 1.5 to 2 hours, wide-ranging discussion. And at the end of that, given the hard facts and what we've learned about their investment process by meeting them face to face, we make a final decision whether to invest in that fund or not. And we do this on an ongoing basis. Any fund we invest in, we at least meet the fund manager face to face or his deputy once a year. We probably meet them on average 2 or 3 times a year. So we like to maintain a regular dialogue with the fund manager to make sure that the initial reasons we're investing with that fund are still valid now. We're not saying we get it right all the time, but we get it more right than wrong. And we think this process is actually quite thorough to select those funds with the favourable risk-return characteristics that we're looking for to include in the IFA investment solutions.